Hi everyone, welcome. Today I'm going to talk about AyurYoga, but I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of where Ayurveda and yoga intersect based on the Tridosha theory. So the Tridosha theory, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, if you haven't gotten to that part in your program yet where we discuss the Tridosha theory, which we have Ayurveda sections in the 200-hour program, and then a much larger one as well in the 300-hour advanced, in the 175-hour core program in the 300-hour advanced. If you haven't gotten to that point yet, then this will be just a very brief introduction to Tridosha theory, because we're just going to briefly review it so that we can talk about Ayurveda in the context of yoga and how to apply Ayurvedic concepts to yoga. So for some of you, though, this might be a review of concepts that you already know really well. So Tridosha theory says that, which is the core theory of Ayurveda, as many of you probably know. Ayurveda and the Tridosha theory says that there are 3 doshas, and a dosha is, I'll name them, vata, pitta, kapha. We pretty much always talk about them in that order. Each dosha represents and is said to be made up of predominantly 2 of the 5 elements. So vata is space and air. Pitta is fire and water. We often don't think about the water part, and we won't talk about it too much today, but that's interesting. And kapha is water and earth. So each of these, anything that we would call vata predominant, whether it's a person, an animal, a food, a season, or a yoga posture or a yoga style, anything that's vata predominant would have the qualities that we ascribe to space and air. So anything vata predominant has a lot of the following qualities, also called attributes or gunas. It's light, dry, cold, rough, light, dry, cold, rough, and very importantly, mobile. So these are the few. Light, dry, cold, and mobile are probably the 4 main qualities of vata that you want to think about when you're thinking about the intersection of how you design a yoga practice and vata. For pitta, you want to think about hot, sharp, and pitta is also more mobile than kapha but less mobile than vata. So for pitta, the 2 main qualities to think about really are hot and sharp. When you're creating a pitta balancing class, think about hot and sharp and how you're going to balance that. And I'll describe a little bit more as we go along, various expressions of sharp. And then for kapha, kapha has a lot of qualities because it's water and earth and it's matter. So kapha, a reminder that kapha qualities and attributes that we might think about when we are designing a yoga class that is kapha balancing. We're designing another yoga class and wondering if it's going to be kapha aggravating. We want to think about slow, static, stable, cool, heavy. So those are the main ones we'd probably think about when we're looking at a yoga class and thinking, I want to add some kapha balancing elements. Well, how do we create a vata balancing, pitta balancing, or kapha balancing class? We want to add opposite qualities, because the 2 concepts in Ayurveda that we use in order to reestablish balance are the understanding that first concept, like increases like. So for example, if I have a kapha type person who naturally already has a lot of slow, static, stable, cool, heavy qualities, what do you think might be a style of yoga that just in general might aggravate kapha? So probably you can guess something like restorative, where the body is placed in a position for a long period of time without any movement. Now, this gives me the opportunity to dispel I guess what I'll call it is a misunderstanding. Just because restorative yoga might not be kapha balancing in the obvious ways, because itself it is slow, static, stable, and heavy, and cool, because there's no movement to generate heat, that doesn't mean a kapha type person should not do it. You may have a person who is either kapha in nature, that's their prakruti, or kapha vikruti. And maybe the type of yoga that they're most attracted to is restorative yoga. Well, heck, you wouldn't want to tell that person, don't do restorative yoga, do something else, because what might happen is they might feel badly about doing a type of yoga that you tell them suddenly is not good for them. Maybe they've already been doing it, or they've been thinking about doing it, and now you've told them not to, and so now maybe they just don't go to yoga. Maybe they're intimidated about even being in a yoga studio, and restorative was their in, you know? So be very, very curious and cautious about saying that any type of yoga is not good for any type of person. I'll give you another example. I have a friend who's Pitta predominant. She's very ambitious. And she has been a yoga teacher now for years. And she specialized in yoga for sleep, ended up developing programs for that. But she told me that her introduction to yoga was Bikram. So this very ambitious Pitta type person was attracted to Bikram yoga because it's got a set sequence, so someone can measure their progress. It's in a hot room, even though she's Pitta predominant. She has some vata and kapha to balance it, so she was able to manage the hot room and feel good in there. The point is, she said to me many years ago now, and I'm so thankful that she did, she said, I don't know if I ever would have tried yoga if a friend hadn't taken me to Bikram. That was my doorway in. So she very quickly realized that that wasn't a style that worked for her, and that helped her achieve her goals, what she wanted out of yoga. But it was a way that she got her foot in the door and started to discover what did and didn't work for her. So when we talk today about what sort of style or qualities we might bring into a style of yoga, or which postures we might use to help balance a particular dosha, be very cautious about becoming at all fanatical. Try not to assume that just because, well, like I said, if a person with kapha imbalance or who is kapha predominant wants to do restorative yoga, support them in that. Even if it might be what we might call kapha aggravating in one sense, that kapha type person might have a very vata aggravated mind, a lot of busyness in the mind, and going to restorative yoga, getting into a yoga studio, becoming familiar with the teachers, having a community of people that they're doing yoga with, all these things will be so nourishing, despite the fact that the style of yoga might be technically aggravating to their dosha. See what I mean? I'll give you one more example just to really drive it home that we don't want to think of any particular style of yoga or posture as being only good for someone based on their dosha, or bad for someone based on their dosha, or based on their vikruti, which is their imbalance. I had another student in yoga teacher training when we used to do them in person. She was Pitta predominant and Vata secondary. And she only did, at that time, she had been predominantly doing Kundalini yoga. And she loved Kundalini yoga. But Kundalini yoga, if you're not familiar with it, it's often quite fast, and it's very stimulating and quite intense and warming. And I questioned her about her choice of Kundalini yoga, and I explained to her why I was curious about whether another type of yoga might be more balancing for her, because she was very interested in Ayurveda and she wanted to know. What we discovered was that Kundalini yoga, those practices were her only physical activity in daily life. So, and they were her only Pitta predominant effect in her daily life. Her work was very slow, very sedentary, nothing too intense. Her life was very slow, very relaxed, nothing too intense. So when you get the idea that a particular style or type of yoga isn't good for someone just because of their constitution, you may be forgetting that there's a whole life that they're having around that yoga class, and that we need to consider that practice within the context of their entire lives. So let's get back to what we might want to think about when we are trying to create a class that might be vata balancing, pitta balancing, or kapha balancing. So the tridosha, I already went through the qualities. If you just are joining now, you can always watch the replay and get them at the beginning of the talk. So if we think about those qualities of vata, light, dry, cold, mobile. Let's think about what are the opposite qualities to those qualities. So opposite to light is heavy. Opposite to dry is what's the opposite of dry? Liquid. And opposite of light, dry, cold. Cold is opposite of cold is hot, and opposite of mobile is static or stable. Static or stable. So how do you bring these qualities into a yoga class? Let's look at the first one, heavy, light, heavy. Let's think about manifestations of these qualities as they express themselves through yoga postures and styles and ways of doing the yoga postures. So what I often like to say when I teach AyurYoga is it's not just the postures we do, but how we do them. What's the quality of mind that we bring to the posture? What's the quality of movement? What are the characteristics of the movement? So if we think of vata being light by nature and benefiting from heaviness, we might start our class with a little bit more stillness. So light, heavy also relates to static, stable, still, and the opposite, and those being opposite to mobile, which is also a major quality of vata. And as well, if we think about our lives are very mobile. So for many of us, we live in an urban environment and we are very mobile throughout the day. We're using cars, we're using faster modes of transportation. And we also know, if we've studied a little bit of Ayurveda, that a lot of people suffer from vata imbalance. So many people can benefit from static, stable, still, heavy. So expressions of that might be having some stillness, as we often do, at the beginning of our class, but also throughout the class. Having some heaviness at the beginning of our class might mean doing our opening breathing practice lying down instead of sitting up, so that the vata type person that is very light and mobile can feel the earth, the stability, the solid quality of the earth. They can feel themselves connected to the earth. So maybe for a vata balancing class, you not only start with more stillness, but you offer the person the opportunity to balance light and mobile qualities by feeling the stable, solid quality of the earth and feeling the heaviness of their own body by lying down for your meditation practice or your breathing practice. This would be very vata balancing. So not only do we want some stillness just at the beginning of the class or in pranayama or meditation practice, because often we are still for those practices, right? So what do we do to make a class even more vata balancing? Well, if vata is mobile, then we want to feel and invoke stillness and stability throughout the class. So what might that look like? If you could speak to me, I'm sure someone has an idea. But I think that one of the obvious ones that probably comes up for us is we can be more still in the postures. So we are, many of us, in a cultural time with yoga where yoga flow is a big thing. Hey, it's in our name, your yoga flow. But that constant movement is not vata pacifying. It's not balancing for vata. It's what vata experiences and feels inside them all the time, is a constant movement, a difficulty, a restlessness, a difficulty with being still, a difficulty with feeling grounded. So do you see what I just did with my words? I slowed my words down and allowed pauses for breath. So you know those moments in a yoga class when you stand in mountain pose, in stillness, and take a few breaths and notice how your body feels, and feel the solid earth under your feet. More of these if you want the class to be vata balancing. Doing a vata balancing class doesn't mean that you can't do vinyasas, that you can't do some flowing movements, but you'd want them to be the minority. And you might also then bring cues in. Feel the earth beneath your feet. Press the earth away from you in downward dog. You might make your voice a little bit lower, more steady. Cues are simpler. More space and stillness, quiet and silence between the words. A chance to stop, breathe, notice how your body is feeling and how it feels to be connected to the earth and working with the earth right now. Draw the energy of the earth up through your feet. Draw the energy of the earth, its stability, its solid quality up through your hands. So once you get going, it's kind of like, wow, there's a whole world of opportunity to make a class more vata balancing. It's not just about the postures you do. How do you do them? What's the quality of mind as you do them? Well, if you're pausing and taking time for breath in stillness to notice how your body feels, you're changing the quality of the mind to a quality that is more still, more stable, more static. So again, you're introducing the opposite of mobility. Constant cues, constant movement, no stopping, flow, flow, flow. Well, that's mobility, and that's going to aggravate vata. So lots and lots of options. Let's talk briefly about postures. I don't think there are many postures that are purely vata aggravating. I do think that just about any posture, even though if you look at a book about Ayurveda and yoga, you will probably see lists of postures that say like these postures are vata aggravating, or these postures are vata balancing or vata pacifying. Definitely, lying in shavasana is going to be vata pacifying for sure. Is a backbend vata aggravating? That's one of the classic examples of something that's vata aggravating. So let's look at what we've learned so far. So a backbend definitely is probably one of the postures that is more vata aggravating than shavasana, more vata aggravating than mountain pose, both of which would be very vata pacifying because there's stillness, there's a connection to the earth. So why about the backbends? What about it? Well, vata I often describe vata as having they're naturally just like energy out into the world, you know, like open it up and give away my energy and love everyone and give out my creativity and share and do and try. And that's beautiful. But when we go into a back bend, we're also physically revealing all of the most vulnerable organs of our body: our throat, our heart, our digestive organs. You know, like it's a very vulnerable posture in that sense. And similarly, we're asking our spine, which is, you know, an extremely mobile part of our body, to go to its very edges of mobility. So it requires a lot of mobility just to do a full back bend, like a big back bend, like a wheel pose. Yeah, upward facing wheel, or even bow pose. These all require a lot of mobility in the spine, and then they take us right to the edge of our capacity. So these would be representations of mobility. And they do tend, for all those reasons: mobility, the vulnerability that comes from exposing the organs. If we think about chakras or bandhas, we would realize that those postures, we would see how those postures could be thought of as postures in which we might lose a lot of energy if it's not appropriately protected. So that's what I want to say, is that even though there is more potential to aggravate vata in a deep full back bend, that doesn't mean that someone who is vata type can't do back bends, and even regularly. What it does mean is that we need to bring awareness, more stability, more slow, static quality to these back bends. So by bringing awareness in, connecting to the earth in the with the parts of our bodies that are touching the earth before we do this deep back bend, listening to our bodies, asking the body, do you feel stable enough? Do you feel strong enough? Do you feel safe enough? Do you feel like you can be mobile without pushing into edges that are unsafe in your body or unsafe in your mind or heart when going into this posture? And if the answer is yes, and you're practicing the appropriate preparatory postures, say that 10 times fast, then yes, absolutely you should be able to do a back bend without aggravating vata. But I will say that as a Pitta predominant vata secondary type person, I have definitely done back bends at times when my body and mind were not prepared for it. And maybe some of you relate to this, but I remember feeling things in my body that didn't feel good when I went into the full back bend. Sensations that I can't even describe, but some of them that I can. I remember feeling like a shaking, a pulsating that stuck with me after I was even out of the back bend. A feeling of really of imbalance afterwards, you know, like feeling a little bit like I've been shocked or something like that for sometimes minutes, sometimes hours later that day. So absolutely there can be some vata aggravating effects to doing a very deep back bend. So just keep that in mind. And really that applies to anyone, not just a vata type person. So Pitta type people, we said the main qualities we'll look at for a Pitta balancing class are, the Pitta qualities are hot and sharp. Sharp kind of manifests in the Pitta psychophysiology as a sharp mind, sharp tongue, a feeling of intensity, intense expressions. And so it's a little harder to find the opposite of that. In Sanskrit, the opposite, in Ayurveda, the opposite is dull. The opposite of sharp is dull. But who wants to go to a dull class? Nobody wants to go to a dull class. So what I think of as the opposite of sharp for Pitta, that you want to introduce into your classes, is I think of grace and softness. So when you think of someone sharp-tongued, the opposite would be someone who's gracious, someone who uses gracious words. So bringing grace into the class, bringing the quality of grace into movements, bringing the word grace into the class, inviting your students to practice gracefully, to move gracefully. I also would bring in qualities for a Pitta balancing class. In the warriors, there can be a lot of sharp in the form of intensity. So if we're really like, we're in there, right? And we're like straight arms and we're working hard and we feel like warriors. Soften the edges of the body, soften the joints. Feel nature gracefully flowing through you as you remain in this posture. The constant flowing movements can work for Pitta because they do have a gracefulness and a feeling of flow. Pittas will tend to get too hot in postures that are held for a long time, challenging postures that are held for a long time. They'll get hotter faster than other people. I used to step out of my teacher's yoga studio in the winter on the West Coast, which is like the low, like 4 or 5 degrees, and stand on the pavement with my bare feet to cool down because I would get too hot, because the practice was slow and it was graceful, but it was challenging. And so I would get too hot in these very difficult postures and holding them for too long sometimes for me. So Pitta, it's good to work with repetition, going in and out of the same posture, going part in it, coming out, part way in it. So like bridge, you come bringing the hips up, bring them back down, bring them up, bring them back down. Invite your students then to hold them up. But if they notice a striving, a trying, a hard working kind of feeling, come back out, just flow in and out. So this flowing, graceful, softening the edges. And there are some classes on AyurYoga Flow that are Pitta balancing, Vata balancing, Kapha balancing, and you'll see that I bring some of these concepts into them. So I wouldn't say that any posture that is held is Pitta aggravating. Many things have the possibility of being Pitta aggravating. The room being too hot, postures being held too long, an intensity in the teacher's voice, an intensity that seems to want to make you be ambitious and do things and try and challenge yourself and go to your edge. I mean, that's all going to be really Pitta aggravating, because if a healthy Pitta type person looking for Pitta pacifying qualities or a Pitta balancing experience is going to come to a class that where they don't want to have themselves be pushed to challenge themselves, because that's reinforcing what Pittas do out in regular life every day. They challenge themselves, they're ambitious, they're self-critical. So generally types of yoga that emphasize those qualities would not be Pitta balancing. That doesn't mean Pittas won't be attracted to them. I bet you'd find heaps of Pittas in a Bikram class or in a hot yoga class, but it's not going to pacify Pitta. It's going to aggravate Pitta. And that doesn't mean they shouldn't do those types, because for some of them, they may have other issues going on, or that might be the only intensity in their lives. So again, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't do them, because we have no idea what the big picture is of that. So finally, Kapha. And I spent a lot more time on Vata because most of us need a Vata pacifying class in one or other way, and at some point or another point or all points, because of our Vata aggravated minds in our Vata dominant culture, which is mobile. Kapha benefits from pretty much any type of yoga. And so the most beneficial for someone who is Kapha, who really wants to pacify Kapha, it's going to be a class that is quite typical of the classes we see. So of a lot of the classes we see that are like more vinyasa, intense, pushing to your edge, challenging yourself, that kind of thing. Kaphas need more intensity. They need the intensity that Pittas don't need. So if someone really wants to balance Kapha and they're willing, then the more mobile, because they're heavy, static, slow, stable. So they want mobile, they want warm room, they want challenging postures, they want flow, but also strengthening. So all of those qualities, which are the qualities we find quite abundantly in a lot of flow and vinyasa style yoga classes, are going to be kapha balancing. So it shouldn't be too hard for a kapha type person or someone with a kapha imbalance to find a class that is kapha pacifying or kapha balancing. So I didn't spend much time on that because I think that's what we default to in a lot of the flow and vinyasa classes, is we default to creating classes that have a lot of kapha balancing aspects because we're challenging ourselves and expending energy and so on. But a lot of the classes that we teach at AyurYoga Flow and that we have on the site, I want to say that they are tridoshic in nature, a lot of them, because they include a balance of all of these things. And so that's sometimes the class that you might want to default to when you don't know your students, and unless you want to offer something really specific, then think about, how can I incorporate all of these elements, something that's pacifying for vata, something that's pacifying for pitta, and something that's pacifying for kapha. And you don't have to try too hard for that, because any active, flowing portion is going to be pacifying for kapha. So I hope that was helpful. It's just a little introduction. And if you have any questions, just tag me in the comments, and feel free to tag me in the comments anytime, even if it's not today, if you're watching a replay later, and I can answer any questions if you still have curiosities remaining. But I hope that was helpful, and that you can use these concepts in a way now to help you design sequences that bring qualities into your yoga classes that you want to invest your students with. I'm sure they will be grateful. All right, have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining me. Namaste.